Well, good morning, everybody. Is it okay if the preachers preach this morning? There's a lot of preachers here, and they want to preach. You know, I am so glad to be here today. Most of you have absolutely no idea who I am. Some of you do. But about 12 years ago, Newbridge Church began as a home gathering in my great room, and because we couldn't come up with a better name for it, we called it The Gathering. And your pastor, and I joke with Tim about this all the time, Tim and Becky, were there since before the beginning. So before Newbridge was, Tim and Becky were. And so they were a part of that, of those very first gatherings. And the reason we're celebrating today here is because about 10 years ago, in March of 2014, Newbridge held its very first public service. We began meeting in the evenings. We were meeting at a facility down in Basking Ridge called Fellowship Deaconry. We were meeting in this chapel that had more 70s wood paneling than you could shake a stick at. And those early days were like any new organization or new thing, this breathless time where we're figuring stuff out and making a ton of mistakes. I remember there was one point where, I read one of those blogs on the internet about like the top 10 mistakes a church planner makes, and I was like, check. And it just went on and on. And I'm beyond thrilled that this thing has outlived me. And I wanted to take a poll this morning. Is it okay if I take a poll? Just to see how far back we go in the room here. How many of you started becoming part of Newbridge when it moved up here to Morristown to Kadena Road? You can raise your hands. This is participation. Okay, so there's some of you who are here then. How many of you started with us at Fellowship Deaconry, whether it was in the evening or whether it was in the morning when we started those in 2015? Yeah, a few more of you. How many of you were in my house? Few of you in the house. Yes, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, about 5 of you. And there's a whole bunch of you that have been pulled into this story of what God is doing since. And that's something I want to recognize as we start out, just like Tim said, man plans, God laughs. I think that's absolutely true. And what is incredible about the time that has happened since is how much my story has been a parallel version of Tim's story as well. Because there's been twists and turns along the way. I think this building is the 4th location Newbridge has been in since its starting. And Tim, in 2018, as he said, took up the role of lead pastor, leading this church as your pastor. And just what God has done here through you guys. God does the work, but he does it through willing servants, people who give God their yes. And Tim, you and Becky and your family and those of you who have worked hard and you've believed and you've put both feet in, when you give God your yes, he multiplies that so far beyond anything you could even imagine. And so in a way for me, it's kind of surreal to be here in this moment, in this place, at this time in my life, with the way the story has unfolded. And it's this incredible God story. And today is a milestone. Today is a mountaintop experience. But you've been in a series here at Newbridge called Reflections from the Desert. And partly because I wanted continuity with where you had been going, partly because it meant that nobody had to make a new graphic. We're continuing in that series today because the reality is Newbridge began in a desert place. Newbridge began in a desert. It began in a personal desert for so many of the people who were part of that initial group of founders who were in the cracks of church, or they're in the cracks of faith, or they're even in the cracks of life. And we just looked around at each other and we said, there's got to be something God wants to do with all of these people who are in exactly the same place. And so that's the incredible, churches when they start, they have these incredible vision statements. That was ours. It was like God has to have something more than what we've seen and what we've experienced, because even in the midst of all of these other things, we're holding on to the truth, to the hope that God is who he said that he was. And so we all kind of felt like refugees trying to start this new thing with bits and pieces of where we'd come from and $0, as Tim said, and whatever cast-off parts and pieces we could find and beg and borrow, and I don't think we ever stole anything, but from any other church. And it started in this very small beginning, but what God has done since is something that we celebrate and we give him all the glory for. Why am I talking about this? Because today is a mountaintop. Today is a mountaintop where we look back and it's easy and it's relatively clear for most of us to be able to say, look what God did. Look what God is doing. Look at how far He's brought us. Look at, even though there were times where it wasn't certain, where it didn't make sense, where we didn't know how it was going to work, look what God did. But I want to connect this mountaintop with the desert. I want to connect these two things together, not only for this occasion as a church, but because I want to talk about the relationship that deserts and mountaintops have with each other. And the reason for that is because life is a cycle. Life moves on. There are high points, there are low points. You can look at your life and you can say that. Does anyone remember right before the pandemic kicked off in the beginning of 2020 and everyone was like, 2020 vision, 2020 is going to be great. And we made all these New Year's resolutions about how it's going to be the best year yet and all that stuff. And then the pandemic happened. You just don't know exactly what's going to happen all the time. And so what I want us to do today is connect these two dots, not only as a church, but personally as well. Because I believe that we, because of who God is, can look at them differently. In the world around us, when we end up in these dry places, these difficult places, and everybody does because life is the way that it is, a desert is this like a wilderness experience, this place that feels like a desert to you. You try to get out as soon as you possibly can. When I travel, I have this curious relationship with the travel industry. My wife travels a lot for work, and so she flies a lot, and she sits in pretty good seats on the airplane. My goal in the entire travel experience is for them to extract as little money from me as possible. So my wife's like, you want to sit in premium? What is premium economy? I don't even know what that means, but that's like apparently the cheap seats with more leg room on United Airlines. I'm like, no, I don't. I will suffer because I will not give these people the benefit of having more of my money than they ought to. And so I'm there and I'm 6'1" and my knees are up in my chin and it's like, I can't walk straight for 3 days afterwards. And it's just, that is my relationship with travel. But it's also my relationship with rental cars. I think the first time I rented a car, I got some sort of nice car. My goal now is to get the cheapest thing that moves and has air conditioning, hopefully. And so that is always the goal. It's like, I just want something that has the right number of wheels, hopefully an engine, and it moves in all the directions that you need it to move. And there was this time where I was visiting my father who lived, he passed away this last year, but he lived out in the desert area kind of northwest of Los Angeles. And so I did my usual thing. I flew in a cheap seat on the airplane, and I got the cheapest rental car I possibly could. And we were meeting at this place out in Borrego Springs, California, which is the desert. There is no cell phone service in the desert, like none at all. And I'm driving this cheap little, I don't even know what it was, car, and it's getting more desolate, and it's getting hotter, and there's nothing anywhere around. And I'm rethinking my whole strategy of getting the cheapest possible thing. I'm like, I don't think this car was made for this. It had some exotic name like cars often do, but it wasn't made for that. And so I did the thing that I think we all would do when we're faced with a circumstance like that, is to try to get out as soon as possible. To try to get out of there as soon as possible before the car breaks down, before we get lost. It was a crazy story that could go on much, much longer. But it's just how we are when it comes to the desert. We look for the shortest path out because it's uncomfortable, it's disorienting, and we might even feel like we're dying. And here at Newbridge, you've been talking about some literal wilderness experiences in the scriptures the past few weeks. The reality is most of us, we may not have had a literal desert experience, but all of us have felt isolated, we felt disoriented, we felt like we're in a desert place. What's a desert? For the purposes of our discussion this morning, a desert, I think, is any place where the things that sustain you and give you identity, security, control are removed. A desert is any place that you find yourself in where the things that have been sustaining you The things that give you identity, the things that give you security, the things that give you a sense of mastery over your life. And that's something we all want, some idea of mastery over our lives. But it's when those things are taken away from us and we're looking and we're just disoriented. We're trying to make sense of where anything is. And Tim has a statement that he has built this series on, and I think it's a great statement. He said this. He said, some of the most important lessons we can learn are learned in the desert. And so some of the most important lessons we can learn are when all those things that give us a sense of security are removed. But I want to add to that statement just a little bit. I think there's things we can only learn in the desert. There's things that God can only teach us in the desert. Now, some of you are saying, Michael, we're glad you're not the pastor here anymore because this seems kind of depressing. We're here to celebrate God's faithfulness. It's been 10 years. Could Pastor Tim get up and talk about something happier? And you should and we should. As I said, I am so glad that this place outlived me. When I look at Newbridge today, it's my greatest joy that it survived Michael Hottie in all of my ways. It makes me so glad. It's a growing, healthy church. I get to do this because you have some of the very best leaders and pastors imaginable in Tim and Becky. When I handed this church off, we'll get into that in a little bit, it's like I had absolute confidence about the quality of the people leading in it. And the thing that matters more than talent, and they're both very talented people, but it's character and it's their heart for God. And if you were to look in the dictionary next to the definitions of character and heart for God, you would see a picture of Tim and Becky Daniels. You absolutely would. You are so blessed. Some of the literal best people I've had the opportunity to be in contact with. My spiritual parents are here, John and Mimi Soper, over in the back. If you were to tell me 10 years ago, hey, the people who, raised you up in the faith, and that's, by the way, if you want to know all the good stories about me, go talk to them afterwards, because they've known me since I was a teenager. I had a mullet. It was a good time. You should talk to them about that. But the idea that they would be part of this idea that was birthed is incredible. I couldn't write that story. Only God could write that story. Here's the other thing. You're here, and you're here. You're all here. And it's the only kind of story that God could write, and He's still writing it, and it's an amazing thing. But the reason I want to intersect this very happy idea of the mountaintop and this not so happy idea of the desert is because as much as this is a great moment, it's also kind of a critical moment. Newbridge is at a critical moment today. Here's the thing, every moment is critical when it comes to God. There's no non-critical moments when it comes to God. And so I want us to understand the relationship between how God uses mountaintops and deserts in our lives and how they're connected when it comes to our sense of purpose. And Tim's already talked a little bit about what that looks like in his life. But the thing is, if we don't understand this correctly, we will misunderstand how God works. And we might just miss God. We'll misunderstand how God works. And we might just miss what He's up to, especially when the seasons in our lives change, and the seasons always change. And so today, I want to look at a desert story. It's one of the ones that Pastor Tim mentioned as the series was being set up. It's in the Old Testament, and it's the story of an Old Testament prophet whose name was Elijah. And it's in the Old Testament book of 1 Kings. We're going to kind of start by setting some background, and we're going to focus in on one passage together. But first of all, what's going on at this point in the nation? Ahab is a king. He is this evil, idol-worshiping king who is reigning over Israel, and he's reigning over Israel with his equally evil wife Jezebel. And they worship all sorts of pagan gods. Baal and Asherah are the big ones. But in the words of 1 Kings and the writers of the scripture, they have done more to provoke God to anger than all the other kings before them. Imagine if that was your bio. And so there are these evil people, and what would happen in the Old Testament was God would raise up a prophet to speak on his behalf. to confront the evil and to show the way and the will and the purpose of God and to call the people back to him. And that's what Elijah is. And so Elijah has been commissioned as a prophet by God. And in 1 Kings chapter 17, he goes to the king, and this is kind of some real chutzpah. He says, you know what? You're not so great, and it's not going to rain for a long, long time because of your wickedness. And he immediately departs. God says, get out, because what Ahab would have done is, because he was a very, 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 very evil, bad king, is he would have killed him. And so he flees into the wilderness, and God leads him there, and into the desert, God sustains him. That's where we pick up our story in 1 Kings chapter 17 and verse 2. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, leave here, and here is where he was by Ahab, turn eastward and hide in the Kerith ravine east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there. So he did what the Lord had told him to do. He went to the Kerith ravine east of the Jordan and stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. So, he has this moment where he's called out into the service of God. It's this very Oceans, you called me out upon the waters kind of moment. Some of you don't know that song. That was very nice. You can listen to that again later online if you'd like to. But he goes out, and it's like this moment, and so he has this encounter with the king, and then he finds himself out in the desert being fed by birds, and not just birds, but unclean birds. And so it's this sideways turn where it's I thought my story was going to go this way. I'm going to speak on behalf of the Lord. And he ends up out in the desert. And then just to make things better, what happens after this is the brook dries up. So there's a little bit of water, then there's no water. It's kind of things get worse. But over the next few chapters of the story in 1 Kings chapter 18, the story goes from a desert to a literal and figurative mountaintop. So it goes from this desolate, small beginning to this mountaintop experience. Because what happens kind of in the storyline is Elijah the prophet ends up confronting some of the prophets of the false gods that Ahab and Jezebel worshipped on this place called Mount Carmel. And it's this sort of very dramatic, kind of funny story where he gets 450 of them out there, and they have a sacrifice off. He's you get a sacrifice, you get a sacrifice, you go pray to your God. And so they all do, and they start cutting themselves, and he just starts hurling insults at them and mocking them. And he's maybe he's asleep, or maybe he's going to the bathroom. You should cry louder. And then there's this moment where the other sacrifice, the sacrifice to God, is doused with water, and Elijah prays this simple prayer, and fire comes down from heaven, and it consumes the sacrifice, proving that God is God and that the false gods are not. And then if that's not enough, Elijah says, you ought to all get going, because you remember how it hasn't rained for 3 years? There's a cloud on the horizon, and it's going to start. And so heavy rain comes for the first time in 3 years. And if that's not enough, just to cap it off, Ahab, the king, and his chariots, he has horses. He's going fast back to where he came from in Jezreel. And Elijah just does a foot race, and he outruns him 17 miles back to Jezreel. So he outruns a chariot. And so you have miracle 1, miracle 2, miracle 3. It's this incredible high point of the story. So it goes from desert to mountaintop. And this is where we pick up the narrative again in 1 Kings chapter 19. You would expect that this is where the credits roll, where the music swells, where everybody leaves the theater. But the story's not done yet. 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 1. Now Ahab told Jezebel, that's his wife, everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with a sword. Side note, there's no more prophets of Baal. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of them. Now remember what's happened. Fire has come from heaven. It's consumed the sacrifice. Rain has come for the first time in 3 years. And then Elijah is suddenly a really, really good track and field champion. 3 miracles. Look at Elijah's response. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, into the desert. He came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. Any of you know someone who's like really dramatic? You're just like, oh gosh, there they go again. So dramatic. You know, this is like that game that many of us have played called Jenga, you know, where you have a whole stack of things and there's just a piece pulled out here and a piece pulled out there and a piece pulled out there. And suddenly at the end of it, the whole thing just falls apart. It collapses, and it collapses quickly. But some of you can relate to this feeling. There's a season that seemed like such a good season in your life, and then a phone call or conversation or medical diagnosis or meeting that you were called into changed everything. And what felt like it was such a high mountaintop experience came collapsing down. And even when things are good, oftentimes after we reach the mountaintop, what follows isn't so much a sense of satisfaction, but a sense of loss. Think about this. You know, you raise your kids and then they graduate and the house is empty. They go off and they get married. You work your whole career, you build something, you lead something, you do something, and then you hit retirement. And then it's like, what do I do now? I know so many people in my line of work and conversations I have, they're like, what do I do with myself now? It's not like I have accomplished all of the things. You accomplish a big goal, and there's this moment where everything is celebrated and it's great, but then there's this letdown that follows after it. Why does this happen to us? It happens because wittingly or unwittingly, we build our sense of purpose on a foundation that is that thing. We build our sense of purpose on a foundation that is that thing. And we do it with the best intentions. That's what I want to be clear about. This is a natural thing that we do. Our drive, our determination, our focus, our commitment, it is the thing that got us to that point. But it's a subtle difference between building it on the thing that God has given us and building our foundation on God himself. Listen to how the story goes on. So Elijah wants to die, verse 5, chapter 19. Then he laid down under the bush and fell asleep. All at once, an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. Sidebar, I'm kind of a dramatic person too. Pastor Tim knows this. One of the things I've discovered is when I'm feeling dramatic, sometimes a meal or a nap, or a meal and a nap are good ideas. Don't do anything when you're feeling dramatic. Go take a nap, go take a walk, go have a meal, just punch the timeout clock for just a moment. But he looked around. There by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. Then the angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. So he got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he just did another little journey. He traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb. This is going to be very significant in just a moment, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night. After the word of the Lord came to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? He replied, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, which is not true, by the way, and now they are trying to kill me too. So this very dramatic story that Elijah kind of gets himself into, and he begins to answer. It's kind of like when we ask, where's God in all of this? Where's God in all of this? And then we do this thing. Look at where he goes. He goes to Mount Horeb. Horeb was known as the mountain of God. It was where all these significant events had happened. where God had worked in the past. You know, the burning bush that we talk about in the story of Moses was at Mount Horeb. Many scholars believe that Mount Sinai and Mount Horeb are the same place. And so it's this place where God acted. It's this place where God was known to be hanging out. One of the things we do when we end up in the desert is we go looking for the last place that we think God might be. We go looking back for the last place that we think he might be. Have you ever done that? You know, you can't make sense of anything, so you go where you think God might be. You go into the church, or you make a call to someone, or you talk to the friend who's a Christian, or whatever it is, because you think God might be in that place. But I want you to see the path of things here. Look at the path of Elijah's life. He starts in the desert, he goes to the mountaintop, and then he ends up back in the desert. Deserts and mountaintops are connected. Deserts and mountaintops are connected. They're not the opposite of each other, they're connected to each other. They're part of the same cycle. And one of the things we need to be aware of is that when we're on the mountaintop, and even when a church is on the mountaintop, God's next move might be back to the desert. And that's not as a means of punishment. There are some things we can definitely do to end ourselves up in the desert. But that is because that is how God works. Why would God do this? Why would God lead us from mountaintop to desert? Here's the reason why. The desert, as only it can, creates a sense of desperation that opens us to release our grasp on the last season and embrace God's move into the next one. The desert, it creates a sense of desperation in us that nothing else can do like the desert does it. That opens us to release our grasp on the last season and to embrace God's move into the next one. And the challenge that we have in those moments is when we've anchored our identity to our present location rather than to God. When we anchor our identity to where we are currently located. If we're on the mountaintop, it is incredibly tempting to anchor our identity to the place where to say, you know, I worked hard and it's here. And yes, God has been faithful, but we put, this is the place, this is the destination, this is where we need to end up. And the other temptation, though, is when we're in the desert to say, God has left me, God has abandoned me, I'm experiencing judgment. It's when we anchor ourselves to the location or the last season rather than to God. Let me share with you the rest of my story. This is the first time I've had the opportunity to stand in front of Newbridge Church since the last Sunday I preached at Newbridge Church before I stepped down and handed it off to Pastor Tim. 5.5 years. And the way we got to that point was something I never expected. You know, Pastor Tim talked about the fact that for years and years we talked and dreamed about being church planners. I mean, this was like the destination for me. This was the last vision that I had in my life. And around the end of 2017, beginning of 2018, I began getting this uncomfortable feeling. And it's one of those uncomfortable feelings. I've walked with God long enough to know where it's starting to go. And I had no vision past where we were as a church. And for a leader, and for a person that is full of ideas, that is a profoundly disorienting feeling. I'm like, I don't have the next step in mind. At the same time, we were trying to find a better location, and we were trying to make some moves, and we just kept running into obstacle after obstacle after obstacle. And I just sat there. I said, God, I did the thing. I did the hard thing. I took the step. You called me out upon the water. Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders. We love singing that. It's so much harder to live that. And I was just like, God, what is going on here? And then God began to show me what he was leading me to do. He said, you opened a door, but someone else gets to walk through that door. this guy who started as your worship leader, way overqualified to be like part-time worship leader guy, Pastor Tim was. I'll never forget the conversation at Starbucks where I asked him, and it seemed like I was asking him to go to the dentist or something like that. It was just, something mildly uncomfortable. But Tim gave God his yes, and that's one of the things I love about Tim. But I remember when it became clear, Michael, your job was to open the door, but it's to set the stage for someone else who's going to take this church into its next season. And that was Tim. And I began to know that with a profound sense of certainty. Not happiness, but certainty. And so in the middle of 2018, I stepped out of this role as a lead pastor here at Newbridge Church and handed it off to Tim. And the only word I had from God was wait. I was like, God, okay, I did the thing. I handed off the thing. I took the big step. What are you going to do now? Silence. And the only word I got was wait until a door opens and then step through the door I open for you. And in the meantime, as Pastor Tim, it was uncanny how fast it happened. All the things we'd been praying for and hoping for and wishing for this church just started to fall into place one after another. You guys moved up here. There was just all these doors that opened. And I'll be honest, it was kind of hard not to take it a little bit personally. God had given me enough of, he'd spoken enough to me to know, he's like, there's some things that are going to open up for Newbridge and you need to not take it personally. So that's the only reason I didn't. I'm not more spiritual than that. I would love to tell you that it was easy, that I was just celebrating the move of God. I was not, because it felt like I had put myself out there. I'd taken the step, I'd taken the risk, I'd paid the price. And some of you can relate to this feeling in your lives. And it was just like somebody else got to see the results. You see, here's the problem. I had built my purpose on how God's purpose gave me purpose. I built my purpose on what God had given to me to do, rather than following him however and wherever he led. And I thought Newbridge was the destination for that, and it wasn't. And there I was in the end of 2018, kind of in this free fall. And I'd be lying to you if I didn't struggle with that, because it felt very much like a desert. And then God, as God is faithful to do, opened the next door. And that door is the church I am currently the lead pastor of, Long Hill Chapel over in Chatham, New Jersey. A little bit of background. Long Hill Chapel was the first church that Grace and I, my wife, came to when we were out of college. And no offense, there's some Long Hill alumni here, and a couple of them are going to watch this later. Everything I did after that was an attempt to do the opposite of whatever Long Hill Chapel was at that time. It just was, for right, wrong, or indifferent. And what happened is I had a friend who was the lead pastor there, and he came, and it's the same story as Pastor Tim. He came to me, he's like, Michael, we need some help with worship. I'm like, I don't do that anymore. But there was something, and by the way, my wife's kind of spoken to this. Some of you are married to someone who is the voice of the Holy Spirit in your lives. You should listen to them more often. My wife said, Michael, I think we ought to do this. And so in the beginning of 2019, I ended up as a worship leader after all of the things, the church plant, all the things that had happened. And I would be, again, lying to you if that was easy. And I said exactly the same things to those people that Tim said to us early on at Newbridge. Like, hey, you're going to stick around? I'm like, nope. I am not. I'm here for a few months until someone better. I made it sound more spiritual than that. But it's just like, I'm just here because I know I'm supposed to do it. But I'm going to move on as soon as something happens. Because I remember praying these prayers. I'm like, but God, I want to go somewhere cool. I want to go somewhere that's like, it's just cooler. I deserve that after this. Here's the problem. When we interpret God's purpose in terms of how we think it gives us purpose, we'll end up missing God. Because here's what I want you to hear. Purpose. Your purpose, the purpose of this church, is a means to an end that is not you. Let me say that again. We ask a lot in our lives and our culture especially, what is my purpose in the world? Let me discover my purpose. We miss our purpose so often because true purpose is a means to an end that is not you. And this is incredibly relevant to where Newbridge is right now. Because you're on a mountaintop. It's easy to say, we have a building. It's a beautiful building. We have great leadership. The lights are on. The bills are paid. Let's make ourselves comfortable. And you know what? There are so many churches statistically that get to that point because they've arrived at whatever they think the goal is, and they lose their sense of mission because it's just easier to keep doing what they're doing. And meanwhile, God hangs a right, and he goes out in a new direction. It doesn't feel like the mountaintop anymore. It feels like the desert, and we're like, I don't want to go out there. This is a great spot. Why would we ever leave this? And when you do that, and when we do that, and when the church does that, we end up missing God. And you do not sound like the kind of people to me that want to miss God. You don't want to miss what God is doing next. But he's not going to go from mountaintop to mountaintop. He's going to go from mountaintop to something that feels like a desert, because that is how God works. So I started back at Long Hill as a worship leader, and I really did think those days were over. I remember that first Sunday. I'm like, what am I doing? And here's the thing I've learned about deserts, and this isn't in the scriptures, but I think it's just true. The first task God gives you back in the desert will often be one you really don't want to do. When you're back in the desert, the first thing he gives you to do, it's probably not this thing that's going to bring the sense of meaning and purpose to your life. It's probably something that you don't want to do. And the story went on. I did that for a while. And then the pandemic struck. And the pastor I was serving with, who's a dear, dear friend of mine for many, many years, my wife and I both are just love the folks we got to serve with. He came to me, he said, Michael, I don't know that I have the energy for this transition into this crazy pandemic time where we're all like preaching to cameras and wearing, trying to figure out social distancing and just all the things that you did. And he said, I think it's time for me to retire. And I want to be honest with you, I had no aspirations for that job in that place. I did not. But through a series of things that God did, because only God would do that, I ended up the lead pastor over at Long Hill Chapel. I went from a church here that was built on purpose to a church that was struggling to regain it. I went from a church where we knew exactly what we were about to kind of, in my mind, the exact thing that I had been trying to lead in the opposite direction of for years and years and years. And there's some of you who are here who are from there. And a couple of you came up to me and were like, Michael, are you sure? You really sure about this? And friends, I want to tell you about what God has done. Because as I stand here this morning, and God is at work here in Newbridge, and it's incredible. It's incredible. It has gone so far beyond anything I could have ever let. And that's a credit to God, but it's a credit to Tim and Becky and all the rest of you, Brian, to your leadership and giving God your yes over and over again. What happened is I went from this reluctant, I will take this role so that the place doesn't close in the middle of the pandemic because I may not be the best person for the job, but at least I'm kind of a known quantity. To now God has done an amazing work there. I remember looking around and there were new people starting to come. It wasn't because of my amazing preaching. It was because of God's faithfulness to his church. And then life transformation started to happen. It's like these stories would happen. They're like, there's this thing that happened. I'm like, I didn't preach about that. But God did it anyway. And it's happening more and more and more. And so we want to be a church over there that is just setting the table for what God is doing. And I went from being reluctant and just like, okay, fine, I'll do this. I know how to do it. I love it, and I don't want to be anywhere else. Don't take this the wrong way. I'm so glad to be here, but I'd kind of rather be there. And some of you are kind of glad I'm over there. But it's what God did. And so God has this habit of starting in deserts because only the power of God can make something good come from the desert. Only the power of God can do that. And so in the story of Elijah, we're going to close the story out. God literally revives him. He meets him with his presence, and then he commissions him for his next season of ministry out of the desert. Look at how the passage goes. Then the Lord said, go and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord. Like if you're in the desert, you can pray for the presence of the Lord. You need to pray for the presence of the Lord. But just know, as we're about to read, that the presence of the Lord will not meet you in the way that you expect that the presence of the Lord is going to meet you. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. All the things we pray God to show up, like the big ways. Sometimes he doesn't show up in those ways, but he always does. After the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood in the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? When you read that in the original language, really a better way of saying it is, what is your purpose, Elijah? Not like, what is the thing you're doing now? What is your purpose? And it's the same conversation twice. He says the same thing again. He says, I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altar, and put your prophets to death with a sword, and I'm the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. So it's kind of the same thing. So he's still stuck. He's back there. But then God does what God does, because even when we're trying to figure it out and we're still trying to hang on to the way things were or how we think they're supposed to go or the way the story is supposed to play out, God revives us, he meets us with his presence, but then he renews us for the next assignment. Then the Lord said to him, go back the way you came. Go back the way you came. Isn't it interesting in my story how God sent me back the way I came? The very thing I was like, it's back there, and I'm trying to go as far this way as I can. Sorry, camera people, I just ran off the stage. Isn't it interesting how God says, no, that thing that you've been trying to get away from, go back in that same direction. And go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel. And anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat from Abel-Meholah, to succeed you as prophet. And some happy stuff. Jehu will put to death any who escaped the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escaped the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him. So Elijah's like, I'm the only one, and God's like, yeah, no, you're not. I'm still at work. So why am I telling you this? As I said, this is a great day for Newbridge. You're on a mountaintop. It's easy to see the faithfulness of God. But the faithfulness of God isn't just on mountaintops when it's easy to see. It's not just when it's up here when we can see it. God is equally and as much faithful in the deserts. He's as faithful in the places where we can see him, and he's faithful in the valleys. He's faithful in the desert. He is faithful when we're in the desert. He is faithful when we think we've missed it or that God has missed us. He is faithful when our purpose seems in doubt. And friends, there may be a time where it's not as easy to see as it is easy to see today the faithfulness of God, but God is still faithful. He is still faithful. He is faithful to you. He is faithful to Newbridge, and he will be faithful to his church as he calls you forward. It'll be tempting to look back at the last thing when God is calling you to look ahead to the next thing. And some of you today, you might be in a desert personally, and you've been mistaking your location for what God thinks about you and the purposes that he has for you. And so today, God is waiting. He's waiting to meet us. He's waiting to meet you, to revive us just like Elijah, to remind us of who he is and what's really true, and then to renew us, to send us on our way into the next season. So today we celebrate the faithfulness of God, but every day, and in every season, we can build our lives on that faithfulness, that he always has purpose that he's always at work on the mountaintops and even in the desert.